The population in China shrank last year for the first time in more than 6 decades. The nation of 1.4 billion people is the most populous in the world, but years of an aging workforce and a strict one-child policy have seen birth rates in China plunge to record lows.
It's worrying because young people don't want to have kids anymore, because the country's getting older and it creates pressure on society.
I don't plan on having kids, and even if I do get married one day, I really want to be in a relationship without children.
Well, to talk more about this now, let's bring in France 24's international affairs editor, Angela Diffley. Angela, talk to us about the reasons behind China's drop in population for the first time in 60 years.
Yes, the population fell by 850,000 last year, nearly 1 million, of course. And it's now, the population of China is at about 1.4 billion. So it's expected that the population of India will overtake China this year. Now, how did we get there? Back in 1979, of course, they introduced the one-child policy in China because the population was growing too rapidly. And this policy, of course, meant that people were only allowed to have one child. If you were found to have more than one child, you might lose your job, you would be fined, you might be forcibly sterilized. And so that was extremely effective. It also led to a bit of a gender imbalance because many families, finding that they could only have one child, chose to have a boy and had an abortion if it was a girl because a boy was more useful economically. So that was extremely effective. By 2016, they phased that out. They were phasing it out beforehand, saying certain people could have 2 children, but by 2016 the policy was over, and in 2022, last year, Xi said it is a national priority to try and increase the population. The problem is that it has turned out to be much easier to stop people having children than to encourage them to have children. The Chinese government has tried tax incentives, cash incentives even, but this cohort of childbearing Chinese has grown up. They themselves had no brothers and sisters. They find themselves 2 parents, each of them having to look after 2 elderly parents themselves. They are used to the benefits of being a single child, and they want the same thing for their own families. So they simply don't seem to want to have more than one child. The other reason is, of course, the burden of looking after their elderly parents, as I just said, and also it's very expensive to raise children in China, and most of those asked cite that as the reason for still only wanting one child. So it's a problem.
It's interesting because some people might argue that a drop in population could be a good thing. Why does it matter?
One of the reasons why it matters is that the Chinese government statistics appear to have been faulty. And this has come about 10 years earlier than expected. China knew that there would be a decline in its population, but it isn't ready yet in any way. Back in 1979, when this was introduced, life expectancy was 65. It's now 75. And there is a huge elderly population. The country's infrastructure, its hospitals, its social care is in no way ready for this sort of a demographic change. And so that poses a major problem. The other thing is China has a cheap workforce. Because the population is so big, there are so many workers, then they can be paid quite low wages. And that has meant that China's economy has grown very quickly. China is in many ways the low-cost labour workforce of the world, so it will impact the global economy as well. So there are significant economic implications for this, as well as the fact that China needs to completely reorganise its domestic system.